Hello and welcome to episode 103 of Linux Dev Time. I'm Joe.
I'm Amalith.
I'm Kevin.
And I'm Andy.
Good to talk to you all again. So today we're going to talk about the differences between being in-person and remote and being synchronous versus asynchronous as a developer. Andy, I know you've got quite strong feelings about being in-person.
Yeah, in my work, I've always been the one who's, I feel like, advocating for more interaction generally between people. And I also find for myself, I get energy from being actually in the same room as people. So there's huge advantages to being able to work with people all around the world in different time zones and so on if you work remotely. But I kind of run down if I'm not in the room with people, sparking off people, drawing things on whiteboards, stuff like that.
Whereas you, Amalith, work 100% remote, right?
Yes, we are 100% remote, and most things are asynchronous. But more and more lately, I've been doing parallel working or body doubling with a friend of mine. We hang out in video call or voice call, and we're just there with each other. If someone needs something, we can say, hey, do you know how to do this? I've forgotten how to do this. Maybe you remember, that kind of stuff. And it's very convenient for both of us.
So what, you just hang out on a call all day?
Most of the day, yeah. We mute when we're stepping away and say, hey, I'm going to be AFK or something like that. But yeah, we just kind of hang out in that room for hours.
And is that what body doubling means?
I don't know. I think so. It probably more depends on who introduced it to you and how they introduced it to you. For me, I was introduced to the concept as an ADHD coping strategy, as just externalizing your motivation. You have another friend there with you. You can help keep each other on task and focused. But Dad, I talked to him about it the other day. He said that he's been doing that same practice, but under the context of a professional setting. It was introduced to him as a productivity tactic for working remotely.
One of the big advantages for me of being in an office sitting near someone is that exact same thing of partly that you can ask things and stuff like that, but also, I guess, just a sense that you're there and that you know you're definitely working.
Mm-hmm.
I've seen it go both ways. I've worked in a place that was 100% remote, and they used a similar thing. They didn't call it body doubling, but we just had these Zoom rooms, or I forget the actual application that we used, but where you could just hang out and code together. You might be working on separate projects, but every once in a while you could look up and say something, or someone could make a joke. And it was one to combat the isolating feeling that can come from working remote. Like, some people get a lot of energy and, can really knock out a lot of tasks when they're by themselves and remote. Others like to have a little bit of human interaction here and there, and being purely remote can be extremely isolating, especially if there's a lot of work happening, but you may not see it happening. It's really easy to fall into a feeling of, wow, I know I'm doing a ton of work. Am I the only one rowing? Am I the only one, going at this? So it really helps to see other people just going at it as well, working tasks and things in a digital setting when you're not there in person.
That's really interesting, because at various times at various workplaces, we've tried to leave an open call for people to drop into and do that, and it ends up with no one going in there. So I've never seen it succeed. So maybe actually making a commitment as just two people is a better way for that to work.
I think I would say forcing it, but having those one or two people say, hey, we're going to be in the room. We've opened it up. Anyone else that wants to join can join us. Just having those few people started off is sometimes enough to have other people join as well. No one wants to be the first person, I think, is how it always goes.
I think one of the other things about in-person working, which I think a lot of my colleagues would not appreciate, is that I actually really like being able to overhear conversations from people who are not doing the same job role as me. So in a lot of offices, there's a culture of, like, if you're there and you're going to have a conversation, you need to go into a meeting room so you're not disturbing people. And it's especially the programmers. You've got to not disturb the programmers. And to me, I like to hear people. I have had very painful experiences, right, living near the sales people. I'm not saying it's impossible to disturb me, but if I hear, say, the product people chatting about something, or security people or something else, if I overhear some of that conversation, it gives me a lot more context about what's going on in the company, how I can help. I can often jump into some conversations and offer some input. It makes me feel part of what's going on.
But conversely, I've heard people complain that they were forced back into the office where everyone just sits in this open plan office on video calls all day.
Yeah.
And it's just chaos.
Yeah, I've got a friend who works for an unnamed large company where they've been forced into the office 4 days a week, and their entire team, everyone in their team is in a different remote location, and all they do is go on video calls all day. But they have to travel 40, 50 minutes into work.
I have mixed feelings on that because I work in an office where we are divided between multiple different offices. So you might have a group of people working together in one office and then another group working in another, and you might all be working on related projects. So we're trying to institute a policy of asynchronous first, as in you either hop on a video call or you send a message in a group Slack message, or so that everybody in all the various offices has awareness on the things that you're working on or the context that you're working on. And that's great because it's really, really frustrating when a small group of people are working on the same problem as you, but they're in an office together and they're just talking to themselves synchronously. And then maybe they make a decision, maybe something happens where you're not actually there and you're not even aware that it happened. So I have mixed feelings. I definitely understand that it can be frustrating to go into an office just to sit in an asynchronous style meeting or asynchronous communications. But at the same time, it's also very, very helpful to people that are not in the room with you.
Absolutely. I think this is the flip side to a lot of the things that I say. Like I love being in the room with people, but I've almost always got team members who are in a different country or whatever who can't be there. So all that good stuff that I'm getting by being there, they're missing out on. So I worked in a team where I said that we had to start having our stand-up meetings over video calls from our desk because we were having a stand-up meeting where we were all stood around a microphone and the remote people couldn't hear and couldn't be heard. And it was terrible. So yeah, the more kind of inclusive and exciting the in-person work is, the more it excludes people who are not there.
I think you've got to put everyone on an even footing, haven't you? Like if you've got 5 people in an office and 2 people remote, it's no good for the 5 people to be together. Everyone should be at their desk with headphones on and, everyone is just in the same situation then.
Yeah, Joe, I think you're hitting on something there. I've heard it said before that you have to be intentionally asynchronous if you're going to be asynchronous. As in, if you're going to practice that asynchronicity, then you have to intentionally do so. People have to be at their desks or essentially just like all of the other bodies that are remote. That way, no one is excluded and you don't form these unintentional cliques and biases for the people that are all just sitting physically together. Now, that doesn't have to be 24/7 every bit of the time, but at least during, decisions or important points of the day, you have to be intentionally asynchronous.
Yeah, for decisions and for activities that are supposed to be for everyone, then that's absolutely critical. My worry is that if you do it the fairest possible way, you actually completely lose out on the benefit of being in the same room as other people.
Yeah, which is my argument. Everyone should be remote. Like, why does anyone need to commute? It doesn't make any sense.
Because my poor little brain can't handle it.
There definitely is a benefit to being in the same room with people or breaking out a whiteboard physically or, a stack of paper. I can't deny that.
I have a lot more fun coding with someone at the same desk or at the whiteboard. I love it.
I think there also just happens to be a lot more of those sidebar conversations that end up leading to some real work. Now, back to the intentional asynchronous, like you have to make a decision and be very conscious of, hey, we're starting to veer into a lane that is applicable to everybody. I either should write up a quick summary and send it out as a message, or we should move to a public channel.
Yeah, I always try and write IRL : and then a load of guff about what we've talked about to try and get across. But it's never going to include people in the same way, but it means that you can at least give people context about what conversations are going on.
But of course, the huge argument for remote work is that you can hire the very best people for the job and be more inclusive with that. You're not only hiring people who can afford to live in the area where the office is, for example, or within like an hour or so's commute.
Yeah, Joe, I absolutely agree with you that it is much better when your talent pool that you can recruit from is much wider. I think it's also better for the candidate as well, because there's been plenty of times where there could be a really cool job in some weird location that I may not have the means or ability to move to, but if they're open to remote, that means I have the opportunity to work with that great team and things as well. So I think it's beneficial in both directions.
So is free and open source software inevitably remote and asynchronous? I feel like although there are various companies who have offices and contribute to open source, the very idea of it is a global distributed system of developing software, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, I certainly think it's very normal for open source projects to have asynchronous artifacts like a Git repo and a discussion list or whatever type of asynchronous discussion, matrix room maybe. So like as a baseline, to be a good citizen as an open source project, you should have all that asynchronous stuff, even if you have an in-person team.
I think also open source, probably from the beginning, but definitely nowadays has helped improve a lot of the asynchronous styles of communication that we use at the day job or even during hobby projects. Open source is the reason we have some of the great tools that we do and that we're able to collaborate with people around the globe in various time zones.
I don't think open source is inherently asynchronous because, for example, SQLite is an open source project, but they don't actually allow any external contributions. It's only the creator and the people who work at that company that can contribute to SQLite. For everyone else, it's all they can contribute are ideas, or I have this bug, here's how I fixed it. Now someone else has to go fix it in the actual SQLite code base.
And I think there's still a huge benefit to it as well. I mean, think of all of the various either products or ideas that are built on top of SQLite or things that SQLite is embedded in and using. So while there may be downsides or there's possible upsides to the way they're doing it, I think while it's not inherently asynchronous to contribute to open source, I think that's still a part of the overall asynchronous open source ecosystem.
That's a fair point.
Normal open source projects, like the normal way that an open source project works is you set up a GitLab page or a Codeberg page and you start adding the code there and people make pull requests and all of that stuff is asynchronous. That's just normal. That would be the default way that you would expect it to work, right?
Mm-hmm.
But then there are some companies that have been set up around open source that sometimes have in-person teams. So the Matrix project started with, I think, 2 locations, but they were both very strongly in-person teams. And they built their kind of core software at that time with that setup. And there have been other examples, haven't there? What are the companies set up around the GNOME project and stuff like that?
Yeah, I think the GNOME project has some pretty famous sprints or where they all get together and knock out a bunch of issues together. And they all speak very highly of that time as well.
Yeah, quite a few projects have these things they call sprints, which are different from the Scrum stuff we were talking about in a previous episode, which means for them get together for a week or 2 weeks and just in person write a load of code together.
And then you could probably also even count some of the hack fests or where you just get a group of people together and they all start working on either a related project or semi-related projects. Sometimes just being in a room together will spur on some new ideas and seeing the cool things that people are building. That can be motivation enough to do some really cool stuff.
I think it is exciting to me that other people recognize the value of that in-person interaction, right? That people, even people who are completely bought into the fully remote style, still see the value in getting together for a week and often get energy from that lasts for months afterwards.
It's sounding like there are very major pros and cons to both approaches, and a best implementation might be a little bit of both.
Yeah, although as soon as you start including people, you start running into issues. And I know that the Python community has really struggled through a lot of issues in terms of funding places for people from different parts of the world and making sure that the funding's going fairly to different people and stuff like that. As soon as you start getting people together, you have to deal with the realities of different people's circumstances and costs and things like that. Not that it's not worth doing, it's a lot harder than just all staying in your little room.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, this episode is sponsored by 1Password. Imagine your company's security like the quad of a college campus. There are nice brick paths between the buildings. Those are company-owned devices, IT-approved apps, and managed employee identities. And then there are the paths people actually use, the shortcuts worn through the grass that are the actual straightest line from point A to B. Those are unmanaged devices, shadow IT apps, and non-employee identities like contractors. Most security tools only work on those happy brick paths, but a lot of security problems take place on the shortcuts. 1Password Extended Access Management is the first security solution that brings all these unmanaged devices, apps, and identities under your control. It ensures that every user credential is strong and protected, every device is known and healthy, and every app is visible. 1Password Extended Access Management solves the problems traditional IAM and MDM can't touch. It's security for the way we work today. And it's available now to companies with Okta and coming later this year to Google Workspace and Microsoft Entra. So support the show and check it out at onepassword.com/LinuxDevTime. That's onepassword.com/LinuxDevTime. Quick bit of admin then. First of all, thank you everyone who supports us with PayPal and Patreon. We really do appreciate that. If you want to join those people, you can go to linuxdevtime.com/support. And remember that for various amounts on Patreon, you can get an advert-free RSS feed that includes either just this show or all the shows in the Late Night Linux family. And you also get quite a lot of episodes a day or so early. And if you want to get in contact with us, you can email show@linuxdevtime.com. So we've talked about the development aspect, but what about code review? There must be some pretty big differences between doing that in person and remotely.
Absolutely. I would say one of the biggest differences is text is hard. It's so easy to misinterpret or to read a comment or a review, which is somewhat inherently critical, is often how code reviews can come across. So to read something that's kind of inherently critical in a negative way is difficult. So sometimes a in-person, or maybe not even in person, but at least synchronous, get on a video call with somebody and go through the code review together, bringing that human element back into it can be so beneficial, because then you just realize, oh, it's another human on the line, and you can talk through any issues, and you can hear the inflection in someone's voice. You can understand what it is that they're looking at or why they're picking out a particular item in the code review. Like, having that sort of human connection in a code review is very, very key in my mind.
Now, what you want to do is just swear at people on the mailing list like Linus used to do.
So, Amalus, do you do calls for reviews in your stuff?
Yes. There's no official policy for how we're supposed to do code reviews. The guy I've been working with, mostly, we've just kind of landed on doing code reviews in a voice or video call, because we can show things on the screen and say, hey, what is this here supposed to do, while I'm testing a feature and demoing it, actually trying to use it. He can say, oh, that's not the behavior you're actually supposed to see. It's supposed to do this. So now I need to go back and work on my pull request a little bit more.
Yeah, sounds great. Yeah, I've always felt like an asynchronous code review, which, by the way, a lot of the platforms like GitLab push you towards, it feels like marking someone's homework, or even worse than that, maybe. It feels like trying to prove you're clever by finding mistakes in someone's homework, right? And so I really much prefer a call or in-person conversation, so that it feels like you're collaborating on making the code as good as it can be. I have actually met some people who have good reasons for believing differently, though. I have one colleague I'm thinking of in particular who they are very, very smart, but they feel like they don't think quickly enough if they're in an in-person conversation, and they want to have time to go over things and think it through. Ironically, they're like unbelievably smart and could absolutely code me under the table, but they like to have the time to make sure they've got themselves straight. So they want to have that kind of preparation time, maybe before an in-person review might be the ideal, but often it ends up as just do it asynchronously.
Well, that's the thing about a text response. It's very easy to type something off very quickly that comes off the wrong way.
Yeah.
But if you take a lot of time over that, you can be very measured about it and be arguably more reasonable than just saying the first thing that comes into your mind on a call. So I do take that argument on board, actually. I think that is a very reasonable way to look at it.
Yep.
Once again, it feels like we can't just come up with a formula for a solution. Finding that mixture, because some people don't want to do in-person reviews because they don't want to deal with that difficult interaction. And sometimes I feel like I want to have them on a call so that we get through the difficulty of that human interaction and end up in a better relationship. But then other people want to actually like improve the relationship by taking the time to express themselves clearly. You know, so it's always different people, different stuff.
I've definitely felt where I want time to prepare and, read through the code at least once before doing an in-person review. I have no data to support this, and I can't back this up in any way, but it definitely feels like an in-person review is far less likely to find those like nitpicky, syntax only changes, or ones where someone's trying to sound very smart and just find all of the little ways in which something was done wrong or could it have been done better. And even when they do happen in a synchronous style code review, it's much easier to see that like, oh, that's just a an off-the-cuff comment or, right off the top of your head. So it's much easier to breeze past or ignore or say like, yeah, I'll fix that, than it is when it's written down in a comment, on a single line, and especially how like GitLab or any of these other platforms do it where they'll have like unresolved issues and there's a list of 30 of them. It feels much more heavyweight, even though it's a much more minor item. So I think an asynchronous style review can help. But yes, there are also times where can be anxiety inducing to start asynchronous review, especially if you're being looked at or being waited on for something.
One thing that I learned in a previous career that I would imagine can be applied to code review is the easiest job in the world is to criticize another person's work.
Yeah.
It's so easy to find fault if that's what you want to do. And I would imagine with code review, it's not about finding fault, is it? It's about trying to be constructive with it. Like there's bound to be little things that you could criticize that ultimately don't matter. Like maybe they didn't 100% follow the style, but it still works. I don't know. Are you really nitpicky about that, Andy? I get the feeling that you might be.
I try and be nice. I will quite often give people reviews where I'll give it a tick, which means you can merge this as it is. But I've also made a bunch of comments that you can apply if you agree with me, right? Stuff like that.
So passive-aggressively saying, please do this.
It's not intended to be passive-aggressive.
I actually enjoy when people do that. So
some of the best reviews I've been involved in, either as reviewer or reviewee, is where we found a really nasty bug that would have gone out into production if we hadn't talked it through together and realized, because you get talking and you're like, well, hang on, what happens when this happens? Often it's the person who's written the code originally who comes up with stuff like that in an interactive situation, because they're talking through how it works and then they think of something.
It's a bit like they're rubber duck debugging with you.
Exactly. What I've been doing quite a lot of recently, I've just, not that recently, but it still feels recent to me. I've joined a team with very complex code base, very complex concepts. So most of my reviews, I have no clue what's going on. So what I really want to do is ask them to explain this code to me as the reviewer. And that can help you learn a huge amount if you treat reviews that way.
Well, it's that whole idea of explaining a concept to someone teaches it to yourself.
Absolutely. And it makes sure that you got it right, hopefully.
Yeah, and I've been in that situation before, not with coding, but with other stuff, where I've started to explain it and I've realized, oh no, hang on. No, I've done this wrong. I need to go away and fix this.
Yeah, because the person who wrote it is most likely in the best position to spot the mistakes, right? But they need to be given a context to do that.
Yeah.
I found it really helped on a previous team where the reviewee, prior to asking for the review, would do a sort of mini code tour or notes to the reviewer to explain certain concepts or things, because they may not even know who the reviewer is going to be. And that really, really helps not only clue some people in on what it is they're looking at, but also starts to see where that developer's mind is at. And you can also look like almost between the lines. You can see like, okay, if they're focused here, but the review touches a bunch of other stuff over here, you can kind of see where things may or may not have been focused on quite as heavily. So that also helps a lot.
Is this not an argument for doing it asynchronously initially and then with a follow-up meeting? Or is that just not really feasible in terms of efficiency and practicality?
That probably entirely depends on the company and their velocity and how quickly they're moving. That's, I would argue, probably the best way to go about it, but it can also be difficult when everyone's working different tasks. And there can be times too where you ask for a review and hopefully you're not blocked on that review. Hopefully there's other things you can work on, but someone may not be able to review your code immediately. They may not be able to drop everything. So sometimes you might be waiting on a review. And if you're also waiting for an in-person meeting to schedule between two parties, which might be in different time zones, that can slow things down. So while it is a much better way, I think it just depends on the actual work that they're doing and the company style as well.
Yeah, it sounds pretty impractical for a lot of companies.
It also depends on whether you're working on similar stuff or the same stuff. If you're working on totally different things, then reviews are like an interruption to your day that you try and get out of the way as quick as possible. If you're working on the same thing together and you're just doing different little bits of it maybe, then the review is just part of your work and then it doesn't feel like you're being interrupted to do it. It's just another part of what you're doing.
I think you might be making a good argument for being in person there.
I will always be doing that, whether accidentally or not.
Yeah, it's all the shares you've got in commercial real estate, Andy. We know what you're all about.
In about 5 or 10 years, there's going to be this revolution where these weird startups appear that say, we found this amazing new way of working where you're all in the same room as each other. It's really productive.
Do I have to wear goggles while this happens, Andy, or no?
No, unfortunately, there won't be any office space left because it'll all have been turned into apartments by then.
Apartments are just cubicles you live in.
Pods, yeah. Right, well, we better get out of here then. We'll be back in a couple of weeks, but until then, I've been Joe.
I've been Amalith.
I've been Kevin.
And I've been Andy.
See you later.